Okay, so we talked about this in the warm-up. So in the warm-up we had 7, 7, and 7 root 2. So there's something in common. There was a 7 in common for all the sides. So if this is 7, 7, 7 root 2, and we, instead of writing 7, we just write the letter n, because it could be any number. It could be 4, 4, 4 root 2, 7, or 12, 12, 12 root 2. It doesn't matter. We're going to call that n. So this is the hypotenuse. You're going to have to know the difference between the leg, so there's 2 legs, and the hypotenuse. If you don't know how to identify the hypotenuse, which you guys have been pretty good at that since we did Pythagorean theorem, the hypotenuse is across from that right angle. So we have n root 2, we've got 2 legs, and we've got a hypotenuse. So if you are starting with the leg and you want to get to the hypotenuse, you're just going to, it looks like you're just sticking a square root of 2 on it, but ultimately what you're doing is you're multiplying by the square root of 2. So multiply by square root of 2. And then if you're going to go backwards, so let's say you're going from the hypotenuse to the leg, we need to do the opposite of what we did to go leg to hypotenuse. So it is the opposite of multiply. What do you think? Yeah, it's going to be divide. So make sure you're not like subtracting things. You're either going to multiply or divide by the square root of 2 today. And that's it. Oh, dividey. Divide. That's all I want to say. Divide by square root of 2. All right, and then today we are going to follow these 4 steps. When we do 30, 60, 90 triangles, we're going to follow these same 4 steps. Like, it'll be a little bit different because this pattern will be different, but ultimately, all we're doing is doing these 4 steps for every single problem. Okay, in these first 3 problems, the way I'm going to show you is just like so you get used to the steps, but my goal for you is when you see these types of problems, you're able to just look at it and automatically know what the answer is without having to go through the steps. And then we get to these more challenging problems at the bottom, and you'll know how to do those steps to be able to solve them. So what are the steps? They are to label the triangle. So my triangle is n root 2. And if you're wondering, okay, how did you know which one n root 2 is? It's the hypotenuse, it's across from the right angle, it's the longest side. The other 2 sides are going to be the same length. So it's always, this is for a 45, 45, 90 triangle, or it's, if you take a square and you cut it in half diagonally, that would be a 45, 45, 90. And we now have the triangle labeled. So the next step, step 2, is circle what's given. So this is given. We're given that n equals 3. Great. Well, the third step is to identify and solve for n. We have now done the first step, the second step, and the third step. So you see, like, these first 3 problems, they go by really quickly. And then you've got to determine, okay, I need to now plug in 3 anywhere where I see the letter n, which in this case, the hypotenuse is n square root 2. So I need to substitute 3 instead of the letter n, and then I'm done. And that's the answer. Okay? So ultimately, remember what I said. All you're doing is you're either multiplying by the square root of 2 or you're dividing by the square root of 2. Here we multiplied because we started with the leg. We went to the hypotenuse. You take 3. You multiply it by the square root of 2. Okay? All right. I'm going to pause. I want you to just find an answer for this one. It's going to be pretty similar to what we just did. So see if you can follow the steps we just did. Find an answer for number 2. Okay. As I was walking by, I saw, well, a few of you with the right answer, so that's good. So we know that n is 5.5. We're going to do the same thing we did before. We take whatever the letter n is, and we're going to multiply it by the square root of 2. So basically, instead of writing the letter n, we're going to write 5.5. So, all right, hopefully you guys can now see that we're going to go backwards. And you look at this and you're like, okay, the hypotenuse is 3 root 2. So you can just take that 3 and you can plug it in for n. Like maybe you're able to see that. If you're not, remember the steps. You label, circle what's given. Well, now we're going to do the opposite. So you see, if you're given the leg, you're going to multiply. If you're given the hypotenuse, you're going to divide. So let's look at this. If we divide by the square root of 2 on both sides, because what are the steps that I'm solving? Label the triangle, circle what's given, and then identify or solve for n. And so you take the square root of 2 and you divide both sides of that equation by square root of 2. Why did I set these equal? So this is what you start with. Why did I set n root 2 equal to 3 root 2? Because that's what I circled. So I set those two things equal. And then I need to then divide by the square root of 2. Because if you have the hypotenuse and you want to find the leg, you need to divide. Well, those are going to cancel out. So n is going to equal 3. Because square root of 2 divided by itself, anything divided by itself is 1. So it just cancels out. Let's follow the steps. We're going to label the triangle. My hypotenuse is in root 2. The other two are in. Okay. And then step 2 is to circle what is given. And then you're going to identify or solve for n. So what do I need to do? I need to set whatever I circled, I need to set those things equal to each other. So that's the point of circling these problems, is because they're going to be equal to each other. And then I need to realize I am given the hypotenuse. If you are given the hypotenuse, in order to solve for the leg, you need to divide by the square root of 2. It tells us that up here. So that hopefully is not a surprise. We're dividing by the square root of 2. And then we're like, okay, n equals 5 square root 2. The problem is you can't just circle this and be done because this is not mathematically allowed. You cannot have a square root in the denominator. If you have a square root in the denominator, you've got to, it's called rationalizing the denominator, but that's just like a big word for you're going to multiply by the square root of 2. Whatever's in the denominator, you're going to multiply. So square root of 2 over square root of 2. Why am I doing, so write that, and then I'll pause for a second, and then I'll explain it. Okay, and so why did just out of nowhere, I come over here and I'm like, oh, we're going to multiply by square root of 2 over square root of 2. That doesn't really make sense. The purpose of it is to get the square root out of the denominator. And in order to get rid of it, to get rid of a square root, you need to multiply by another square root, because when you multiply two square roots, they cancel out. But the problem is you can't just get crazy and multiply by a square root for no reason. And the way that you're not changing the actual problem is because you're multiplying by the square root of 2 over square root of 2, which is actually just like multiplying by 1. So that's why it's not really changing anything. So now that we're multiplying by this, we're going to go across, stick those together, so multiply 5 times square root of 2, and then you look at your calculator, and you can type this in if you want, or just realize that the square root of 2 times the square root of 2, and make sure you click this white button to get out of that square root, they should be separated, is going to just be whatever number is under the square root. So they end up canceling out. Okay? And then you are done, because both of these sides, C is going to be 5 square root 2 over 2. So that is like your final answer. So yes, this is confusing. It's a little bit challenging. Anytime you have a whole number on the hypotenuse of a 45, 45, 90 triangle, you are going to have to do this and rationalize the denominator. Okay? When there's a whole number on the hypotenuse, that's when you'll have to do that. You have a question?
I want to ask you this every time.
Yeah, so anytime this is a whole number. See how all of these are like something different? Like this is not a whole number. It's got a little square root on it. This is not a whole number, which this one is tricky because you're going to have to rationalize it. But no matter what. So on your assignment today, number 5 and 7, you're going to have to do this. So if you want to write number 5 and 7 next to this problem, this is what this is going to look like. All right, next one, in root 2. I labeled, and then I figure out, circle what's given. So we're looking for E, I'm not going to circle it. This is what we're given. So we know that n is 5 square root 5. And we know that anytime we're given the leg and then we need to solve for the hypotenuse, we need to multiply by the square root of 2. So we need to take n and we need to multiply by the square root of 2. Okay, how does one do that? Well, you take the two things that are under the square root and those are what can be multiplied. So this 5 and this 2 can be multiplied. That 5 on the outside cannot. So that just stays put, and the inside becomes 5 square root 10. So our final answer is 5 square root 10. That's what the hypotenuse equals. Because you're given the leg, you need to multiply by the square root of 2. If you're given the hypotenuse, you need to divide by the square root of 2. It's the same pattern every single time. All right, last but not least. This is my hypotenuse. This is in root 2. This is in and this is in. So we are looking for our legs. We are given the hypotenuse, so we're going to eventually divide by the square root of 2. But before we do that, we need to set these things equal. The things that we're given, set them equal to each other. That's always the next step. All right, and then you're given the hypotenuse, divide by the square root of 2 to get the leg. And then you look and you're like, oh, I've divided by the square root of 2. I'm done. But you're not, because there's a denominator, like the denominator, the bottom of the fraction, has a square root in it. So that's a problem. In order to get rid of that, you've got to do this thing, rationalizing the denominator, or multiplying by whatever's down there. So most of the time today, today it's going to be square root of 2 down there. It might change. It will change when we get to different types of problems. But just know you're always multiplying by whatever is in the denominator over itself. Okay? All right. So remember, when we're multiplying these, just like we did here, the 5 and the 2 can get multiplied. The 4 has to stay the same. All right. What's 3 times 2?
6.
It is 6. You cannot believe how many people want to write 5 there, because they just want to add them. But you will get it wrong. It's 4 root 6. 3 times 2, not 3 plus 2. There's no plus signs anywhere. And then square root of 2 times the square root of 2. I did this in the calculator earlier. It's the same answer as before. It's just going to be 2. But you are, again, not done. It's like it never ends, I know. But if I do this, yeah, it's 4. If you saw this, you would know that you're just simplifying the fraction 4 divided by 2. But since you've got a square root of 6 on it, it looks all sorts of crazy. But you just simplify that. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And so your answer is 2 square root 6 for both of these. And that's it.